We turn now to our panel for some analysis. Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist and host of The Fray on SiriusXM, which debuts this week. Congratulations. Radhika Jones is the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair. Lanhee Chen is a Republican policy advisor and fellow at the Hoover Institution, and David Sanger is a national security correspondent and a senior writer for The New York Times. David, I want to start off with you with all the news that we heard on this program in the past week with Iran. What is the next step? What does a diplomatic resolution actually look like?
It's interesting. We heard Secretary of State Pompeo talk so much about a diplomatic solution and then basically say the only solution is for Iran to fundamentally change its nature and its character. I don't think it's likely that we're going to see only diplomacy used in this case. I think that the president feels like he's got to do something more.
I'm told you there's a problem with your mic, so I'm going to come back to you to let you finish that thought. Lanhee, if you would pick up, it appears that the president is reluctant to use military force. That may surprise a lot of people, given his rhetoric. John Bolton's gone from the National Security Advisor job. Robert O'Brien's now in that position. Are we going to watch him pushed more towards negotiations and away from war footing?
I think the president's going to get a variety of options from Robert O'Brien. I've worked with him. I've known him for a while. He's got great bedside manner. He's going to be able to give the president that panoply of options. Really, as a national security advisor, be an honest broker, I think, in a lot of ways. But his views on Iran, I don't think fundamentally all that different from where John Bolton was. I think the question now becomes for the president, going into an election year, how does that affect the way that he views these conflicts in foreign policy? And I do think it's going to turn him away from that war footing, away from more greater possibility of kinetic involvement in the region, and more toward diplomacy and things that he can market on the campaign trail.
David, let me come back to you. What does diplomacy accomplish? Like, what are we going to see here at the UN this week when you hear the secretary say he's going to sort of prosecute the case publicly?
Well, the first problem that the Secretary has had is that the Europeans have never been with the United States and with President Trump on his decision to get out of the Iran nuclear deal. I suspect what you're going to hear a lot of this week is that this attack, which even Secretary Kerry agreed had Iranian fingerprints on it, even if they didn't launch it from Iranian territory, is the reason that the world's got to get unified against Iran. I'm not sure the Europeans are going to buy that. You also saw the Secretary be a little bit cagey when you asked him about whether or not the United States would use cyber as a way to retaliate. The U.S. has used cyber attacks against Iran 3 times over the past decade. It wouldn't shock me if you saw that again as the non-kinetic option to avoid the problems that Lanhee was discussing.
Ben, what do you think is playing out here? Because there are calls, particularly from the more so-called traditional wing of the Republican Party, the Liz Cheneys, the Lindsey Grahams, who say you have to do something that you can claim, cyber you can't.
They can make the strong argument that the Iranians should not be able to hold the world's global oil supply hostage, that there has to be a significant response on the part of the administration. But the president here is really boxed in. He's made an argument to his supporters over the past several years that America's involvement in the Middle East is something that was largely a mistake. Now he faces a situation where the Iranians are, from the perspective of a lot of people, exploiting that message. They understand that he's headed into an election year, and they want to box him in a scenario where he has to make some kind of concessions. I think, though, that this is something where there's going to be a lot of new voices in the room, Robert O'Brien being one of them, who are going to have to find a way to navigate this in a way that satisfies the president's priority, which I think is to remove himself, as Lanhee said, from any kind of kinetic action over there.
Radhika, you also heard on Capitol Hill some more reluctance when it comes to treating Saudi Arabia like an ally that you have to take military action to defend.
It's an interesting position when you juxtapose it with the president's support after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But I think that the thing that strikes me about this is that the president is very willing to escalate his rhetoric on Twitter. But when it comes to his base and when it comes to the critiques that he's had for other leaders about getting entangled in that region, it's harder for him to act on it. And he has traditional advisors on the one hand, and he has Tucker Carlson on the other hand. And the voice of Tucker Carlson and his base is important to him.
It was interesting to hear Secretary Kerry, though, say essentially He is showing restraint, something that very few people thought Donald Trump would do, be restrained.
He has the rhetoric as a way to satisfy his desire to seem strong, his desire to project power. But then when it comes to the actual formation of policy toward the region, this is a situation where you can't let the Iranians come in and just thumb their nose at the global community, say, we're not even going to accept a UN investigation before it even happens. I mean, that's sending a clear signal about the way that the regime views the rest of the world.
Radhika, the other thing we saw here in New York and really around the world were these climate-related protests led by young people calling for action. I mean, the UN's always the Super Bowl of diplomacy, perhaps this year more so than ever, but what does it all add up to? Well,
it's striking that on that point, the U.S. is sort of a non-presence this year. I mean, climate is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. You saw the turnout from Gen Z. It's not even millennials anymore. It's people who are on the cusp of voting. They may not even be there yet, but they feel an existential crisis. And what's striking to us in New York is that the U.S. is no longer, can't claim any leadership on this issue. And it seems like the attitude of the rest of the world is, well, we're not even going to bother to try to persuade anymore. We're going to forge ahead without them. That's new for the U.S.
David, what will we hear from President Trump when he takes the podium at the UN General Assembly?
I think that you will hear the president basically make another form of his America First argument with a twist. And the twist is going to be that the Iran situation poses the United States and the world with a freedom of navigation, a freedom of oil supply issue that everybody should roll around. So in other words, he's taking what the American interests are and trying to globalize them. And that's part of an evolution of Donald Trump that I think is kind of interesting. I think the other interesting evolution comes out of your question about how he has become the more cautious player in the room. Because suddenly a president who was used to declaring that Barack Obama had not done enough, was overcautious, which I think you could make a legitimate argument about, has suddenly come face to face with the realities of escalation. And so you saw him pull back from that attack when Iran downed the drone. And his own advisors, including Secretary Pompeo, as the Times reported this morning, were concerned that he would seem like President Obama seemed when he pulled back from the attack on Syria. So the president, oddly enough, has become the most cautious one in the national security team.
It's fascinating, the evolution. We have so much to talk about. I want to take a quick break and continue our conversation on the other side with our political panel, so stay with us. And we are back now with our panel. David, it's a challenge to unravel what is a very complicated story with Ukraine, but I know you're up for it. This began with the intelligence community whistleblower saying that there were concerns about a phone call and what happened on it between the president of Ukraine, we learned over the course of the week, and President Trump. And now you have the president himself out there saying there was no quid pro quo, there was nothing wrong on this, but throwing some question on his political opponent, Joe Biden. And his own personal attorney is campaigning for a Ukrainian investigation into his political opponent. I mean, it's all very unusual, but what do people at home actually need to know about it?
Well, it is pretty complicated, Margaret, but I think the core issue here is there are two separate topics. The first is that did the Obama administration and did Vice President Biden interfere on behalf of his son in any way to get a prosecutor in Ukraine fired back in 2015. The prosecutor was Viktor Shokin. He was considered pretty corrupt by the IMF, by the European Union, by the United States. It was no secret the U.S. was trying to get him ousted.
And Secretary Kerry talked about that.
And he did get, yes, and he did get ousted. So now comes the question of the conversation that the president had with the new Ukrainian President Zelensky. And the question was, in the course of this conversation, did he, up to 8 times, according to the Wall Street Journal, urge the president to reopen this investigation into the Bidens and all of that? And was there held out, either explicitly or subtly, the military aid to Ukraine that is being used to go ward off the Russians? And astoundingly, just as this whole whistleblower thing came together, that aid, which had been frozen for months, suddenly flowed about 2 weeks ago with no explanation from the White House. So there's a lot of question of, did the president seek interference in the election, seek this against the Bidens, and did he release the aid as part of it?
Lanhee, it's sort of a standard talking point that secretaries of state say, I'm not here to talk about politics, I'm only going to talk about foreign policy. But Secretary Pompeo bit at that one. Why?
Well, I think there are two layers here. One is a political layer, and the second is a legal layer. All right. So the politics of this for the administration, in some ways, raising the issue almost sort of begs people to ask the question, well, what did happen there? Well, I don't know about that story. Tell me more about that. And so it gets into the politics of the election cycle in some ways, in a way that arguably could benefit the administration. The legal question separately is there more that can be done to strengthen the intelligence community's ability, the IG's ability in particular, to refer something to Congress, even if the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, doesn't want that to happen. So that's a question for Congress, whether the law needs to be strengthened to give the whistleblower more protection.
Ben, you were trying to jump in there.
I just wanted to point out that through the domestic political lens here, what the president wants is to be able to cast aspersions at candidates who he views as being potential threats. He used very effectively the Clinton Foundation against Hillary Clinton in ways that can be debated about to this day. He wants to find other aspects of this that he could use potentially against Joe Biden. There isn't anything directly about Joe Biden really that you can use that's out there, but his son does have a couple of relationships, foreign relationships overseas that can be questioned and have been questioned, and that's something that I think is, as an issue, something he'd much rather have Joe Biden talking about at this point for the past week, as opposed to the economy, healthcare, or any other thing that actually relates to voters' lives.
And if you look at just the latest poll out of the Des Moines Register, it reflects something that even CBS saw, which is Elizabeth Warren in the past few weeks is only rising politically, potentially as a threat to Joe Biden here, who was seen as a front runner for so long. Radhika, what do you see this sort of encapsulating in terms of where the Democratic Party is headed?
Well, Warren has had a great week, and I'm going to say something that might sound trivial, but it's not. Her campaign announced this week that she had taken her 60,000th selfie. She has been a master of the selfie line, and it's increasingly a topic of conversation because it gets to the core of her appeal. She's a grassroots campaigner. She is a person who wants to fix things for individuals, for families, and she's getting that across by sticking it out after her speeches and after her rallies for 4 hours at a time, taking photographs with individual voters. And they are feeling that connection to her. The other thing that it demonstrates is that she has stamina. And we know how that became a football in 2016 between Trump and Hillary Clinton. I think Elizabeth Warren's getting ahead of that.
You have a group of candidates, all the three top candidates for the Democratic field and the president himself, who are all septuagenarians. And she is proving that she has the ability to go out there and embrace crowds with energy, to continue to interface with them. The one thing I think is going on here that we have to keep in mind is the White House has for months now liked her as a candidate. I think personally the president wants to run against her, but I also believe that that might be mistaken given her theory of the race, one which I think is very coherent and is connecting with a lot of voters.
Lanhee, do you think that we actually will see Congress try to take on any kind of gun reform?
Not in a meaningful way. I think that there will be some effort to demonstrate maybe some action on it. Folks are going to talk about it. You might even hear some alternate proposals being floated. But there is no political incentive for either side to work with the other one going into an election year. That's fundamentally the challenge we have. So no, I don't see anything big happening.
All right. It was great having all of you here. It's such a key week in New York. We will be right back.